Welcome back to our English First Additional Language with the Miss Lituti. On today's lesson, we are going to look and study closely concepts on how to analyze a poem before we can even go into the prescribed poems for English First Additional Language Grade 12. I want to take you through these few concepts that will assist you to have in-depth knowledge in as far as analysis of literature is concerned and how to actually analyze poetry. Now, we do have various explanation and quite a plethora of definitions of poetry. What do we mean by poetry? What is a poem? The different definitions from various school of thought in as far as literature is concerned. But in my simple terms, I would say poetry is nothing but a set of a literary work that uses words to express ideas, feelings, and emotions. Now, the question is, if you are given a poem, what are those tips and nuggets that you can use to analyze and understand a poem? First and foremost, when in grade 12, you should all understand and be in a position at this time of the year. It is expected from your good self to be in a position to distinguish between figurative language versus literal language. You must differentiate between the two, because I can fully understand and concur with many learners who would say, I'm reading this poem, nothing makes sense to me. Best believe it happens to us, even teachers. At times we find it difficult to understand what the poet is saying. But I believe after this lesson, you would be in a better position to fully comprehend poetry. And at a later stage, now I'm going to take you through steps and ideas, and if not principles on how to respond to questions based on poetry. But let us establish first the analysis part, how to analyze poems in such a way that you understand them. Why am I kickstarting the lesson with these two concepts? Remember what poets do. They would use words in an artistic manner. That means that they are going to use figurative expressions to convey, if not to communicate, their ideas, their emotions or feelings, or whatever subject that is being discussed in that particular poem. So I'm going to, please look in the description box. I've attached the link for the lesson that fully unpacked the figures of speech. Let me just be honest with you, grade 12s. There's no way that you can go and write paper 2 without understanding figurative expressions, because the figures of speech are actually the skeleton, if not the backbone of a literature and a literary work. We rely on them to thoroughly understand the various works of various authors in literature, because we've got different authors with different writing techniques, writing styles, and writing dynamics. So for us to understand what they say in a literal sense, it means that in a plain language that is easily understood by myself and you, we need to understand figurative expression, how to spot them, and how to explain their effectiveness. Once you are able to explain the effectiveness of a figurative expression, it means that you are able to take a figure of speech from a figure of speech, now transferring it into a literal. Allow me to make a very easy example. I can say that she is a rose, right? This is a figure of speech. Figurative expression is a language that uses figures of speech to compare, to convey meaning, to express emotions, or to communicate a particular idea. It might be in a form of a sound device. It might be in a form of a comparison. It might be in a form of contradiction. For example, like the use of irony, antithesis, paradox, and so forth. Please do check the video on figures of speech before you can even view this video. Now, poetry, or rather, poets will use figures of speech. Now, when you analyze a poem, you're simply changing a statement from a figure of speech to a literal meaning in such a way that we get to understand the meaning behind a particular line. So for us to understand the meaning behind that particular line, it means that what you need to do is to decode a figure of speech or figurative expression into a literal meaning. A literal meaning, it means it's a plain, straightforward meaning that is not used in a form of a comparison. For an example, if I say she is a rose, I've used a figure of speech to compare this particular human being to a rose. It's a direct comparison, and you know that a direct comparison in English we call it a metaphor. I've compared a lady to a rose. So whenever you come across two things that are compared or two people that are compared, what you look out for when you have to explain the effectiveness, you look for the similarity. What are the qualities of a rose? Normally we know that the rose is a very beautiful flower that is able to bloom even around the thorns. So basically it means, in a literal sense, what do I mean? I mean that this lady is beautiful. So in a plain language, which is literal, it means that the lady is beautiful. But in a figure of speech, I can say she is a rose, where I've used now a metaphor. So please go through the figures of speech before you can even view this video. So you must be in a position to understand that basically what you are doing when we are analyzing a poem, we are distinguishing, if not understanding, if not outlining figures of speech, and then now we are using our own understanding to analyze them in such a way that we know to identify, if not to explain their effectiveness. And so once we explain the effectiveness of a figurative expression, that is why now we take the meaning from figurative to become how literal. It means that we are taking a complex sentence that is somehow formulated in a complex manner. Now we are taking it into a simple language for us to understand the ideas that were communicated or are communicated by that particular poet. Right. Now you have a poem. The first tip here is to read a short biography, have some knowledge about the author. It is important to have, just even if you don't need to know 15 or 50 pages about that particular author, but just to have a brief knowledge about that author. For example, you've got Hopkins, who wrote in last year's poems, he wrote, oh my God, I forgot the poem, but in this year's poem, he wrote On the Grasshopper in Cricket. When you look at his poems without even delving deeper into the poem, because you understand his background, that he's a Christian and he is motivated by nature. Hence, most of his poem, he celebrates the beauty of nature. So why is it important to know just a brief background about the author? One is to know the era in which the author lived, and then what is that stimulated or motivated the author to write that particular poem. So you would understand that, for example, this is a poet who was more inclined to political matters. So therefore, most of his poems sound like a protest poem or poems around maybe apartheid and freedom and so forth, because you understand the subjects that stimulated or the subject that motivated him. So it's important to know just a brief background about the author, especially what kind of subject is that particular author mostly motivated about, so that when you read the poem, for example, when you read Hopkins' poem, automatically you expect to read something about nature, because that is what most of this poem is echoes. So echo rather. So it just have a brief background about the author is important, and then know the time period, so that you understand, as in, does this poem talk about things that are happening currently, or does it project things that will happen in the future, or arguably is it things that happened in the past? So the time frame of the events that are taking place in that particular poem is actually important. And then also vocabulary is important in poetry. Make sure that you familiarize yourself with all the prescribed 10 points, and ensure that you understand the definitions of the new words that you come across. Because with English, even if you can read one paragraph, should you come across one word that you do not understand, it spoils the entire meaning and understanding of that particular stanza or particular line. So it is quite important that you know that how to thoroughly interpret, if not to define, those new concepts that you came across in that particular poem. And then you read it aloud, and then you get the general idea, which normally you get it in your summary of your study guides. They will give you a summary that in this poem, the writer celebrates the beauty of spring, or in this poem, the writer or the poet celebrates the beauty of nature. So you should have an idea. However, before you can get to the general idea, spend a greater portion of your time Also analyzing the title, because the title itself gives it's an indication of what is that is expected or to read about. You can also make predictions from just a title. For an example, let us take one of the prescribed poems that we have. Right, one of the poems in English First Additional Language is the poem titled Hard to Find. You take that title alone, the question that should come, a title should stimulate your thinking and your curiosity. What is that you would expect in that particular poem? Because once I see a title of that nature, I'm asking myself, what is it? Is it hard to find in this poem? Okay. And then in essence, the poem takes us through the writer's struggle with words, that there are moments where the poet feels that words are so easy and freely accessible, but however, this on the same wavelength, he finds himself or herself in a position where words are very difficult for her to find in such a way that he can use or she can use words to express her deepest emotions. So hence is the title Hard to Find. So once you interact with the title, you have that a picture of what is there to expect in a poem, and then you can also have predictions as well as questions that as and when you analyze in your analysis, you will answer that those questions that were stimulated from analyzing the title itself. And then from there, after reading, you must get the general idea. And of course, there's no way that you can get the general idea without unpacking the poem line by line, of course. And that we can do, you will see how I unpack the poem line by line, and then also paying specific attention to the use of figures of speech and their effectiveness. You must also check if there are characters involved in it. There, does the poem talk about nature or does the poem talk about characters? For example, in the poem Reciprocities, the poet talks about or takes us through his childhood life and the interaction between him and his mother. So in that particular poem, we do have characters. So in other poems, depending on the subject that is being discussed on that particular poem, you would have characters. In other poems, you wouldn't have characters. Find a turning point if possible. There are poems that have transitions or contrast. For an example, especially in the sonnets, you'll see that when we analyze various, when I upload more lessons where we now analyze the actual poems. Here, remember, I'm just taking you through the concepts that will assist you in analyzing poems. The turning point, what do we mean by a turning point in literature? It's having a subject that has been discussed, or having remember, poems can also be in a poem or in a form of a narrative, where maybe a poet is taking us through his childhood life and so forth, and narrate about his childhood and so forth. So the turning point, it might be possibly, for an example, in a sonnet where an octave can present a problem only to find that the sestet present a solution. So we have transitions and turning point, but that can be easily understood once we do the actual poem. And then what is also important, grade 12, so please pay specific attention to also discussions of themes. Themes, it means nothing but the main idea communicated or conveyed in that particular poem. Because after reading anything that is being written, it is your duty as a reader to find out what was the essence, if not the purpose of that written piece. So the theme is important. You need to understand the theme. Is the poem centered around love? Is it centered around hate? Is it centered around the power struggle? Is it centered around the beauty of nature? Is it centered around death? Because you should expect questions where examiners would ask you to discuss a particular theme based on the context of the poem. So what you should know at this point in time, it is that a theme basically means the main idea conveyed, if not communicated, if not the main message communicated in that particular poem. And then what is also important to note is the diction, the choice of words that are used by a particular writer. What do we mean by diction? Again, I'm going to link one of my old videos where I think I explain diction as well as tone. When we speak about a diction, we actually refer to the choice. we refer to the choice of words. Because remember, here we are studying the art of words, the manner in which the poet uses words to describe. It might be emotions, it might be feelings or ideas. So with diction, diction is important because from a diction, we are able to deduce the tone, and then ultimately we are able to deduce the mood. What do we mean? And remember, these are very important concepts because you are going to be asked, you should expect questions around the concept of tone, because you have questions where the examiner would say, identify the tone used by the poet in line 14, and then the following up question, of course, is going to be, is the tone to justify whether that particular tone is appropriate. But the question is, before we can even get there, do we thoroughly understand these concepts? Diction is nothing but the choice of words. The choice of words. Is the author or the poet using positive words? Is he using negative words? If you are reading a poem and, for an example, The Slave Dealer, it's very rich with graphical words, words such as war, blood, the pool of blood, and so forth. So when you look into those words, they paint an image of I would say something very disheartening and something very graphic. So to arrive at a point where you thoroughly understand the diction, you check the choice of words. But if you read a poem and it's all about smiling, calmness, the kindness, then you see love. That is what it's a positive poem, because the diction that is used there is actually polite words that are not really have connotations or negative connotations towards them. So diction, it means the choice of words. And then diction should also feed into the tone. Remember, what do we mean by a tone? A tone is the attitude of the author towards a particular subject. A tone can be sarcastic. A tone can be maybe also humorous, if maybe whatever the poet is conveying there has a sense of humor. A tone can be fearful, if maybe the author or the poet expresses his fear. A tone can be light-hearted. A tone can be nostalgic, if the poet is reminiscing about his childhood or his past. That can be nostalgic. So you need to broaden your scope of vocabulary as far as identifying the tone. But what I can safely say to you is that if you can pick up the diction from the poem, what kind of words are embedded or used in this particular poem, and of course the diction must match with the tone. For an example, I can't say diction, the poem is flooded with negative words, however the tone is pleasant. There's no way that the tone can be pleasant if automatically the diction is negative. So it means if the diction has negative connotations, I'm expecting tones such as a sarcastic tone, a brutal tone for that matter. So a mood, you must be able, please also check, I'm going to link 2 clips. I'll link the first one where I analyze, I teach you how to identify figures of speech and explain their effectiveness. The second one, I'm going to link my old video on how to differentiate between a tone and a mood. And then now, a mood is a feeling that you get as a speaker, not as a speaker, as a reader. A tone is an attitude, right? For an example, in the poem Inversnate, we see Hopkins very concerned about nature, right? He even uses a rhetorical question that what would happen if nature perishes? What would happen? And that tone, it's pleading. He uses a rhetorical question to plead with people to let nature be and not disturb it, right? So that tone is pleasant. And why do we say it's pleasant? I'm informed by the choice of words that he uses. He's not harsh there because he is pleading with the people to let nature be, because he's trying to convince people that indeed nature is beautiful and it should be left undisturbed. So hence I say diction must fit to tone, and then mood, it will be your feeling as a reader. And I would say to you, simplify it. When you are watching a movie and you go like, oh, shame, you are associating your emotions with what is transpiring in that particular scene. That is the mood. Once you are able to say, oh, but this is sad, that is the mood. So the mood is the responsibility of the reader. Whatever emotion that is being deduced or picked up by the reader, that is the mood. But the tone is determined or dependent on the author or the poet himself by a choice of words. That means it puts us in a position to check the quality of words and the choice of words versus the attitude of the author towards that particular subject. So the manner in which, for example, Hopkins in Inversnate writes about nature, you see from his choice of words that he admires nature, he loves nature. Hence, towards the end of the poem, he actually pleads with people to say, can we please guard and take care of nature and let it be? You look into such. So it means that for you to win in poetry, you need to study words closely. So that is why in my own view, I would say poetry is nothing but the art of words. It's nothing but the art of words. I've already spoken about words that are unfamiliar. Please make sure that in all the 10 prescribed poems, you are able to remember various vocabulary, especially new words, so that the lines can make sense to you. Words that are particularly descriptive, because remember, we are relying, or the authors rely on an artistic manner of using words to convey their emotions. Words will be used in a form of descriptive. And now, if we jump a bit to paper one, we did say that descriptive words are nothing but what? Adjectives. So you must also take note of adjectives. How is he using words to describe? It can be objects, it can be nature, it can be human beings, it can also be emotions. Words in the title, I've already spoken about the title. Look up for words, even if you know their meanings, to see. Yeah, this is also important. You may assume that you know the word. Don't be in a hurry to say that you know a word. Check how the word is being contextualized in that particular poem. See how the word is being used. It might, remember, we've got what you call a double meaning or ambiguity, where one word can mean this in another sentence, only to find that in a different sentence that word has a totally different meaning. So it's important that you do vocabulary enrichment activities in as far as using the dictionary to understand and unpack new words that you come across in a poem. Right, now let us continue to go through the concepts that we are going to use when you analyze poems. Now, mostly when I teach my kids how to analyze poems, I encourage them to rely on imagery. What do I mean when I speak of imagery? I did mention that I know the difficulty that comes with paper two, especially poetry, that you can read something and it makes no sense to you. But once you know what I've alluded to earlier, figures of speech versus literal, and then you check imagery. Imagery, it means that when you read a poem, paint those pictures in your mind. Because if you don't paint pictures in your mind, you won't be able to breathe life into those particular lines. So imagery, it means that, remember, authors of, if not poets, use words to paint a particular picture for you. It might be in a form of a descriptive. Some poems are actually a combination of a narrative as well as a descriptive. Descriptive. I haven't discussed the forms of poems, the structures of poems as yet. I just want you to take through the few concepts that I believe that can assist you. So as in when you read a poem, you must be in a position to tell us, is this a poem narrating? For example, when you read the poem Reciprocities, that poet is the poem. In the poem Reciprocities, the poet takes us through his childhood life and how he reflects on his childhood and how he used to help his mother through their knitting sessions. He thinks about his mother. So how his mother would make him hold the skins of wool so that she could roll it into a ball. You look into such a poem, it's a combination of both descriptive and a narrative. A narrative in a form that he is telling us a story, taking us back through his childhood. However, he uses descriptive word to describe the manner in which he was holding that wool, how he was seated, how the mother would make him hold the wool in such a way that they turn into a skin of ball for them to knit a jersey that can fit the poet. So you look into such and such poems, we call them free verses because they do not confine to a particular structure. So when I analyze various poems from the 10 prescribed poems, I'm going to explain fully the difference between a free verse, which normally come in a form of narrative and descriptive, and then what you also mean by a sonnet, which normally these are structured poems. It means that they follow a particular structure, and then with the free verse, the lines might be uneven, it might be uneven lines, very uneven stanzas and so forth. But with sonnet, we know that it's just one stanza of 14 lines. And then, of course, we've got what you call the Shakespearean sonnet, and then we also have what you call the Italian sonnet. So I will explain these two concepts when we now analyze the actual poems. So the purpose of imagery is to paint a picture so that you can understand. If a poem is in the form of a story, paint that picture in the form of a story so that, remember, why are we doing all of this? It is for us to arrive to a point where we can confidently, if not successfully, discuss the theme. And there's no way that you will be able to discuss the theme if you do not know the general understanding and the general meaning of the poem itself. And for example, under images, they can use allusion, which is a biblical reference. Poems can also use animals. They can use plants. For example, there's a sonnet there on the grasshopper and cricket. That poem uses insects to celebrate the beauty of nature and to show how the beauty of nature is everlasting and omnipresent. That poem uses insects. So hence, I've drawn you to this particular concept so that when we go back to the actual poems, you do remember that. And also time, or is it the day? And this, on the very same poem, on the grasshopper and cricket, we are differentiating between two seasons. Are we talking about places? For an example, in verse 8, it talks about a particular village in Scotland. Now, all these things assist us to have a particular images or a set of images that which can assist, if not aid us, to easily understand or to easily unpack the particular lines and the general meaning of the poem itself. So read it through. Now, once you read a poem, you have read the title, you know the background of the author, just so that you know and understand what is that author, the subject that motivate the author. Is it the author that writes about politics? Is it the poet that writes about nature? Is it the poet that writes about love? So you would know just a brief background about the author, and then also be in a position to know all the figures of speech, from the comparisons to the sound devices to the contradictions. If you do not know figures of speech, you won't get paper to write. But if you can understand the figures of speech, and I will show you how to explain their effectiveness when answering questions, you are definitely going to flow in paper 2. And then also time frame. You should understand, is the poem speaking to the current events? Is the poem speaking about things that will happen in the future or things that happened in the past? And mostly we have, I think predominantly these are, we have quite few new poems that are written recently, but in our prescribed poems, we have a combination of old classical poems like your Hopkins, like your Sonnet 73 of William Shakespeare, as well as recent poems. So you should be in a position to note such. And then also we spoke about not forgetting setting. For an example, like I've said, in verse 8, it talks about a particular village in Scotland. Sometimes a poem can also indicate to us the setting so that we know the kind of place where action is taking place in that particular poem. And then also what is important is the characters. But I did mention and emphasize that it's not all the poems that will include characters. It's dependent on what is that the poem is about. And then you need to understand the subject matter that is being discussed in that poem. Is that love? Is that the poet's experience? Is that the poet's childhood? Is that the poet's concern about nature? Is that the poet's affection with nature? Is that the poet? So you need to understand the subject matter that is being discussed so that when these images that are used in that particular poem, you understand their symbolism representation. For example, When you go to a poem on the grasshopper and cricket, we know that the poet there uses the two insects to represent the beauty of nature, that which cuts across both summer and winter. So the symbolical representation of the two insects is to represent, one represents summer, one represents winter. And in essence, the two insects are there to indicate, if not to convey, the idea of the beauty of nature, even across various seasons. So you see what I've done? I've used the images in the form of a symbolism. Remember, a symbol, it means it's an object that represents something, or an object that has or carries the message of the poem in that particular poem. So when you read a line, check, is this line a descriptive? Is this line a comparison? What is being compared to what here? What are the objects that are being used? What are the animals that are being used? Okay, fine. Now the question is, why are they being used? How are they being used to convey that particular message? So in essence, these are the few concepts that I can take you through for now. The rest of the concepts I'm going to delve deeper, or should I say, everything that I've been taking you through or explaining here will come to life now when we analyze our first poem. And then immediately after this lesson, I'm going to upload the first lesson that will be a sonnet on the grasshopper and cricket. Let us continue to sharpen our language skills. And please, grade 12, please don't gamble with your future. Don't just say you want to know 2 poems or 3. Please know all the 10 prescribed poems, because we don't know which poem examiners are going to use. So you should be in a position to know all of them, not forgetting vocabulary and finding out the definitions of new words. And of course, in our new lesson now, we are going to unpack the poem line by line. Thank you so much. Don't forget to like and to subscribe, and stay tuned for our preparation for paper 2 final examination.